Kaitlyn Conley was 23, a receptionist, a bright smile, a familiar face in the office. She worked at a wellness clinic run by Dr.Mary Yoder, a woman who treated patients with kindness, who believed in natural healing. One summer morning, Mary felt sick. Nausea, stomach cramps. She thought it was the flu. By nightfall, she was in the hospital. Within days, she was gone. At first, doctors thought it was a virus, then maybe food poisoning. But the lab results told a darker story. Mary's body had been slowly attacked from the inside. And it wasn't a stranger who brought it into her home. It was someone she trusted, someone sitting just feet away. This is the story of a murder that stunned upstate New York. A beloved doctor, gone in just a matter of days. A family torn apart, not just by loss, but by suspicion. At first, no one could believe it. Who would want to hurt Mary Yoder? She was a wife, a mother, a healer. Her patients described her as gentle, generous, full of life. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered secrets hidden beneath the surface. Jealousy, betrayal, and a shocking suspect much closer than anyone could have imagined. What followed was not just a search for justice, but a trial that exposed the darkest side of love and loyalty. This is the case of Kaitlyn Conley, the young woman accused of poisoning the very person who trusted her most. Mary Yoder was never supposed to be remembered as the center of a murder trial. To the people who knew her best, she was so much more than a headline, so much more than a tragic case. She was a respected chiropractor in upstate New York, a woman who had built her life around healing others. For decades, patients walked into her office with pain, with discomfort, with the weight of their problems pressing down on them. And they walked out lighter. People described her clinic as a place of comfort, a space where health and hope were restored. In a profession where trust is everything, Mary was the kind of doctor who never broke it. But Mary wasn't only a doctor. She was a wife, a mother, and a mentor. She had built a family, raised children, and invested herself in the people around her with the same energy she poured into her work. Younger practitioners looked up to her not just because of her medical skill, but because of her compassion. She lived in a way that made others feel cared for. For many in her community, Mary was the person you could go to when you needed guidance, someone who had a way of making you feel safe. Those who knew her best often described her with the same words: warm, kind, generous. Mary gave freely, of her time, of her knowledge, of her energy. Friends and colleagues said she had no enemies. She wasn't someone who held grudges or created conflict. If anything, she was the first person to step forward if someone was in need. Whether it was offering help to a patient who couldn't afford treatment or giving support to someone in her family who was struggling, Mary was always there. She had a giving nature, the kind of personality that drew people in. Her belief in natural healing wasn't just a philosophy she practiced in her clinic. It was the way she approached life. She believed in treating the body gently, respecting its balance, and finding ways to heal without harm. It was this dedication to health and wellness that made her sudden collapse so shocking. How could a woman who embodied vitality, who lived her life to promote health, suddenly be the one struck down? In the summer of 2015, Mary began to feel ill. At first, it seemed ordinary. A wave of nausea, stomach cramps, the kind of symptoms that most people might dismiss as a flu or a stomach bug. She brushed it off, assuming it was temporary. But as the hours passed, the pain deepened. By nightfall, she was in the hospital, fighting symptoms that no one could yet explain. Within days, she was gone. The loss stunned her family, her patients, and her community. For someone so deeply connected to life, so devoted to health, the idea that she could be taken by sickness seemed unthinkable. It wasn't just that she died. It was how quickly everything changed. One morning she was at home, carrying on her life as usual. Days later, she was gone. That kind of sudden absence leaves a shock that doesn't fade. At first, the explanations were simple. Maybe a virus, maybe food poisoning. People searched for a cause that would make sense. that would explain how someone like Mary could be struck down. But when test results revealed something darker, the reality became harder to accept. Mary hadn't just gotten sick. She hadn't been the victim of bad luck or an infection. She had been poisoned. Her body had been slowly attacked from the inside until it couldn't fight anymore. The contrast was devastating. A woman who had spent her entire life promoting health, wellness, and healing others, ended by something that destroyed her from within. For her patients, it felt impossible. How could their doctor, the one who had always been so full of energy, suddenly be gone? For her family, it was even worse. They had lost not just a mother, not just a wife, but a future. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone stolen in a matter of days. The grief was overwhelming. Her children were left to face the rest of their lives without her guidance. Her husband was left without his partner. The home where Mary had once been the heart and center became quiet. Even in her absence, the imprint she left behind was everywhere. Her patients mourned not just a doctor, but a person who had made them feel safe, who had taken away their pain when they needed it most. The void she left was irreplaceable. That void is what made the truth even more unsettling, because Mary hadn't died of chance. She hadn't died of illness. She had been deliberately targeted. And if someone like Mary Yoder, loved, respected, with no enemies, could be poisoned, then what did that mean for everyone else? The betrayal cut deeper because it came not from a stranger, but from within the circle of trust, from someone who had been sitting just feet away. Mary's death wasn't only a personal tragedy, it was a shock that rippled through her entire community. She had been a fixture of stability, someone people thought would always be there. The idea that her life could end so suddenly, and in such a violent, hidden way, left people shaken. Patients who once walked into her office to feel safe now walked past it and remembered the crime. Neighbors who once saw her smile now spoke about her murder. In the courtroom years later, her family would talk about her absence in ways that made the impact clear. They didn't just lose a loved one, they lost the milestones of the future. Weddings she would never attend, grandchildren she would never hold, holidays that would always feel empty. Those aren't the kinds of wounds that fade with time. They linger, every year, every gathering, a reminder of what was stolen. Mary Yoder should have been remembered for the life she lived, a healer, a mother, a woman who gave more than she took. Instead, she became the victim of a crime so cold, it stunned even seasoned investigators. Her story is one of contrast, of light snuffed out by darkness, of trust turned into betrayal. And for those left behind, the shock still resonates. Because if someone like Mary, a woman with no enemies, a woman who devoted her life to helping others, could be poisoned in her own home, then no one is safe from the shadows that sometimes live closest to us. Kaitlyn Conley wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. She wasn't an outsider plotting from a distance. She was 23 years old, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and she had been welcomed into the Yoder family's world. To most people, she was the smiling receptionist at Dr. Mary Yoder's wellness clinic in upstate New York. Patients saw her at the front desk, cheerful and polite, someone who made the office feel inviting before they even stepped inside an exam room. But Kaitlyn wasn't just an employee. She had a personal tie to the family that ran much deeper. For years, she had been in an on-and-off relationship with Mary's son, Adam. It was through Adam that Kaitlyn became woven into the Yoders' lives. She shared dinners with them, joined in family gatherings, and for a time seemed like she could become a permanent fixture in their world. That familiarity, that closeness, would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. The relationship between Kaitlyn and Adam was never simple. Friends described it as volatile, a cycle of breakups, reconciliations, and constant emotional turbulence. One week they were inseparable, the next they were fighting bitterly or cutting ties, only to reconnect again. It was the kind of relationship that left everyone around them exhausted just watching it unfold. For Adam,
It seemed to be a struggle between wanting to move forward and being pulled back by history. For Kaitlyn, it was something deeper, more consuming. She appeared unable to let go, clinging to the relationship even when it was clear the love had turned toxic. Friends remembered moments of jealousy, arguments that escalated quickly, and Kaitlyn's habit of holding on to grievances long after Adam thought they were resolved. She had a way of keeping the tension alive, of making sure wounds stayed open instead of healing. At the same time, Kaitlyn could project a very different image to the outside world. To people who didn't know her closely, she seemed bright and ambitious. She was someone who had plans, who spoke about her future, and who carried herself with confidence. Patients at the clinic remembered her as kind and approachable, someone who made them feel at ease before they saw Dr. Yoder.
But behind that polished exterior, cracks were forming. Those closer to her began to notice troubling signs, flashes of manipulation, sharp words fueled by resentment, and an intensity that felt unsettling. She could be warm and charming one moment, then cutting and vindictive the next. In her relationship with Adam, those tendencies became more visible. Friends would later recall incidents that felt like red flags, even if they didn't see the full picture at the time. Kaitlyn seemed obsessed with Adam's attention, angry when he pulled away, and determined not to let him move on. When they broke up, she didn't just feel sadness. She radiated bitterness. It was as though the idea of losing him wasn't something she could accept, not emotionally and not psychologically. Looking back, some of these moments felt like warnings. The volatility, the controlling behavior, the inability to let go, all signs that pointed to deeper issues beneath the surface. But in real time, they blended into the chaos of a young couple's drama, the kind of turbulence people often dismiss as just relationship problems. For the Yoder family, Kaitlyn was still part of their circle even after the relationship with Adam faltered. She worked at Mary's clinic, saw the family regularly, and remained a presence in their lives. To Mary herself, Kaitlyn wasn't an enemy. If anything, she was another young woman she had welcomed and supported, someone she saw as family. That trust would prove fatal. When Mary suddenly fell ill in July 2015, the thought of poison was nowhere in anyone's mind. She had stomach cramps, nausea, fatigue. It looked like a virus, maybe food poisoning. The family was worried, but no one suspected foul play. Why would they? Mary had no enemies. She was a woman devoted to healing, kindness, and generosity. But as the hours passed, Mary's condition worsened. Within days, she was gone. And when the toxicology reports revealed she hadn't died of illness but of colchicine poisoning, the horror deepened. This wasn't an accident of nature or a cruel twist of fate. It was deliberate. Someone had slipped poison into her body. The question was who? At first, investigators cast their net wide. Was it a patient with a grudge, a mistake in supplements, a rare contamination? But slowly, painfully, the focus shifted. The poison hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside Mary's circle. That meant someone she trusted, someone who had access, someone who was there, sitting just feet away as her health failed. And all eyes turned toward Kaitlyn Conley. Her closeness to the family, her work at the clinic, and her tumultuous relationship with Adam all combined into a profile investigators could not ignore. On the surface, she was a grieving ex-girlfriend, still connected to the family she once hoped to marry into. But beneath that, cracks of bitterness and obsession pointed to something darker. The picture of Kaitlyn that emerged was one of contrast. To strangers, she was pleasant, professional, even caring. To those who knew her best, she carried an undercurrent of anger, of envy, of something unresolved that burned quietly until it erupted. The story of Kaitlyn and Adam wasn't just a young romance gone bad. It was a relationship that revealed hidden aspects of Kaitlyn's psyche, an inability to move on, a fixation on control, and an emotional volatility that blurred the line between love and resentment. Those signs, unnoticed or unheeded at the time, would later take on chilling significance. Because when prosecutors built their case against Kaitlyn, they argued that this wasn't just about a breakup. It was about revenge, about a young woman who couldn't let go of a relationship and who chose to strike back in the most devastating way possible, by targeting the mother of the man she once loved. The smiling receptionist who greeted patients at Mary Yoder's clinic, the young woman who shared meals at the Yoder family table, the ex-girlfriend who once envisioned a future with Adam. She would soon stand accused of poisoning Mary, of masterminding one of the most shocking betrayals imaginable, and the evidence against her was only just beginning to surface. If you want to hear more cases like this, where trust turns deadly and the truth hides in plain sight, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. And let me know in the comments, do you think justice was truly served in the case of Kaitlyn Conley? If you want to hear more cases like this, where trust turns deadly and the truth hides in plain sight, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. And let me know in the comments, do you think justice was truly served in the case of Kaitlyn Conley?
She smiled the moment I walked in. She adjusted my back and asked about my daughter's graduation. She was glowing, like she always was. Nothing about her seemed sick. She looked perfectly healthy. It's hard to believe that just hours later, she was fighting for her life.
That memory captured the cruel contrast of what was about to unfold. Because by late afternoon, Mary started to feel an unusual wave of fatigue. At first, she brushed it off. Everyone gets tired. Maybe it was just the summer heat. Maybe she had skipped lunch. She told herself it was nothing serious. But within hours, that tiredness hardened into something darker, something no water or rest could fix. That evening, as she sat down in her kitchen, the feeling sharpened into stabbing pain. Her hand went to her stomach, her body folding as she sank into a chair. Alarmed, her family rushed to her side. They watched her pale, struggling to breathe through the pain. In a voice that barely carried across the room, Mary whispered words that froze everyone in place.
Something's wrong. I've never felt pain like this before.
Her family tried to reassure her, telling her it was probably food poisoning, maybe a stomach virus. They thought rest would help. They settled her in bed, hopeful that a night of sleep and medicine would calm whatever storm was passing through her body. But as the hours dragged on, things only got worse. The pain intensified into waves of nausea that wouldn't let up. She vomited again and again until she was too weak to stand. Her skin went clammy, her breath shallow, her eyes heavy. It was clear this wasn't just exhaustion or the flu. Panic set in, and her family rushed her to the hospital. Doctors worked quickly, running blood tests, monitoring her vitals, asking questions about what she had eaten or whether she had traveled recently. To them, it looked like a severe infection, or maybe poisoning from food or water. But every test seemed to contradict the last. Nothing explained why a healthy, active woman was spiraling so fast. Mary clutched the hands of her loved ones who gathered at her bedside. Her voice was faint, broken by short gasps for air.
Please, don't let me die. I don't understand what's happening.
Those words cut through everyone in the room, doctors, nurses, family, because they carried the weight of pure fear from someone who knew her body was failing her. Within hours, her condition worsened. Her body grew weaker, her organs shutting down one by one. She slipped into a coma. And just days after she first felt tired, Dr. Mary Yoder was gone. The news shattered everyone who knew her. Family members collapsed into grief, unable to comprehend how a woman who rode her bike every day, who was full of energy and optimism, could be taken so suddenly. Her patients were stunned too. The doctor they had relied on for years, the one who had helped them heal, was dead. It felt impossible. At first, the explanation seemed to be some kind of sudden illness, a tragic medical mystery. But when the autopsy report came back, everything changed. Toxicologists had found something unexpected coursing through her system: colchicine. Colchicine is a chemical sometimes used in small, carefully measured doses to treat gout. But outside of strict medical supervision, it is deadly. It has no taste, no smell, no warning signs until it's too late. In Mary's body, the dose was massive, far beyond any medical purpose. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a side effect. It was poison. The reality hit hard. Mary hadn't died of natural causes. She had been deliberately poisoned. For her family, the grief turned into horror. This meant someone close to her had planned it. Someone had slipped poison into her food, her drink, or the supplements she took daily. Someone had watched her deteriorate, knowing what was happening, and had let her suffer. Detectives now faced the questions no one wanted to consider. Who had the opportunity to tamper with her meals? Who had access to such a rare and dangerous substance? And more importantly, who in Mary's trusted circle could possibly want her dead? The answers would lead them to a face that was already familiar, not a stranger, not an enemy from the outside, but someone who had once been welcomed into Mary's home, someone who had eaten at her table, someone who smiled at her every day in the clinic. And before long, investigators would begin to suspect that the person responsible for Mary Yoder's death was sitting right inside her family's world. Mary Yoder's death didn't just leave an empty chair at the dinner table. It tore a hole straight through a family and a community that had relied on her kindness for years. In the first hours after she passed, people tried to find comfort in simple explanations. A sudden illness, a medical anomaly, something random and cruel that no one could have predicted. But the autopsy stripped away that fragile hope. The toxicology report was unambiguous. Mary had been poisoned. The moment those words sank in, grief hardened into fear, and fear into a single, brutal question. Who could have done this? Investigators began where every good investigation begins, with what was known. Mary had no enemies. She had not been extorting anyone, suing anyone, or threatening anyone. There were no simmering divorces, no business disputes, no debt collectors, no angry patients with a vendetta. She was the person people went to for relief, not the person anyone would target for revenge. A stranger attack made no sense. This was not a stabbing in a parking lot or a burglary gone wrong. The poison had to come from someone within reach of her daily life, someone who knew her routines, someone she trusted. Detectives moved quickly to map Mary's days. Who sought her in the mornings? Who prepared food, shared coffee, handled her supplements, tidied her kitchen? Who had keys to the clinic and access to her workspaces? Who sat close enough to see what she ate, what she drank, what she took to stay healthy? The more they looked, the tighter the circle became. Family members, clinic staff, and the people who hovered around both worlds, home and office, without raising alarms. The toxin itself was the next clue. Colchicine is not something you stumble across on a grocery shelf. In minute, carefully measured doses, it can help treat gout. Outside that narrow medical use, it is catastrophic. It is colorless, tasteless, odorless. It works quietly, disabling the machinery of the body cell by cell until vital organs fail. Whoever introduced colchicine into Mary's system had not acted on impulse. This required research, intent, and access. It required planning. Investigators secured Mary's home and the clinic and began a careful sweep for anything that could carry a contaminant: leftover food, open beverages, the coffee maker, mugs, water bottles, pill organizers, vitamin bottles, herbal capsules. In Mary's kitchen and in her bathroom, they found several bottles of supplements she took regularly. She was dedicated to health. Vitamins and natural remedies were part of her routine. The bottles were cataloged, sealed, and sent to the lab. When the results returned, the pieces began to click. Traces of colchicine were detected in capsules that should have contained nothing more than benign ingredients. Someone had tampered with supplements Mary trusted and consumed daily. This was not a single dose slipped into one meal. It was deliberate and layered, a method designed to weave poison into her life until her body could no longer fight back. The implication was chilling. The killer had patience. The killer had proximity. And the killer wanted Mary to look like she had died of illness. With the supplement finding, detectives narrowed the practical pool of suspects even further. Tampering with capsules requires time, privacy, and uninterrupted access to the bottles. Who had that access? Who could have been alone in the house or at the clinic long enough to open, adulterate, and replace capsules without being noticed? The list grew short. People who were in Mary's trusted daily orbit. Then, just as the investigation was tightening, an unexpected twist arrived at the Oneida County Sheriff's Office. An anonymous letter. It was typed, unsigned, and written in a tone that tried to mimic certainty. The writer accused Adam Yoder, Mary's own son, of poisoning his mother. The letter claimed Adam had access to colchicine and a motive born from personal disputes. It urged investigators to look no further than Mary's child. The letter struck like a blow. If true, it would transform a murder into a Greek tragedy, a betrayal from within the bloodline itself. Detectives took the allegation seriously. They had no choice. But as they read the letter again and again, their instincts bristled. Something about the language felt off, overheated, theatrical, almost pleading for attention. It didn't read like the steady hand of a whistleblower. It read like someone trying to shove suspicion in a very specific direction. They examined the envelope. They studied the phrasing. They considered the timing. Why now? Why this? And why Adam? There was no financial benefit for him, no life insurance windfall that would point to greed, no history of abuse or conflict that would support hatred. He was devastated, broken by his mother's death, barely able to speak in full sentences without his voice breaking. None of that proved innocence, of course, but the letter felt like theater, not truth. Detectives decided to treat the letter not only as an accusation but as evidence itself. If this was a misdirection, then the letter might be the killer's own footprint. They sent it to forensic specialists for handwriting pattern analysis, even though it was typed, because written communication carries more markers than letters on a page. Spacing, line breaks, punctuation habits, the rhythm of phrasing. They tracked down potential printers that could have created it, comparing ink and micro-impressions. They analyzed the diction, unusual word choices, the cadence of sentences, the way certain ideas were repeated. Piece by piece, the mask began to slip. A name crept to the center of their analysis. Kaitlyn Conley. She had been Adam's on and off girlfriend, and she had worked at Mary's clinic, a double link to both spheres of Mary's life. The letter's phrasing, its emotional color, even the style of emphasis, echoed messages Kaitlyn had sent in the past. The printing characteristics matched a device linked to her. What had seemed at first like a horrifying accusation against a son now looked like something else entirely, a calculated attempt to frame him. With their suspicion sharpened, detectives pivoted to the digital landscape. They sought warrants for phones, laptops, tablets, cloud accounts, anything that could hold a search history or a purchase trail. In modern investigations, truth often hides in caches and cookies, and this case was no exception. On Kaitlyn's devices, they found queries that drained the blood from the room. Colchicine lethal dose, colchicine poisoning symptoms. How long does colchicine take to kill? How to get colchicine. The searches were not academic. They were practical. They were timed. Many aligned with the weeks and months leading up to Mary's collapse. Purchase records were worse. Orders for colchicine were traced back months before Mary died. Even when intermediaries or aliases appeared to obscure the shipments, the digital fingerprints, IP addresses, account recoveries, overlapping phone numbers, pulled them back toward Kaitlyn's control. If intent had a shape, this was it. Then investigators found the kind of detail that tells a jury not just what happened, but who was thinking about the aftermath. Searches about life in prison, sentencing guidelines, and famous poisoning cases involving women. This wasn't panic in the moment. This was contemplation before the act. Someone had stared at the horizon of consequences and kept walking anyway. The physical evidence continued to align with the digital. Supplement bottles that Mary had taken daily bore microscopic signs of tampering that were consistent with capsules being opened and resealed. Trace distribution of the toxin within the bottles suggested multiple altered capsules rather than a single contaminated dose. That pattern matched the clinical course of Mary's deterioration, and it matched the strategy of a killer who wanted the cause to appear natural until it was too late. Detectives interviewed clinic staff, friends, and family, listening not only for what was said but for how it was said: hesitation, defensiveness, rehearsed certainty. They watched Kaitlyn carefully. She had an answer for most questions, and when she didn't, she redirected. She remained composed, sometimes too composed. When asked about Adam, her tone sharpened. She brought up grievances without being prompted. She emphasized conflicts. She repeated themes that mirrored the anonymous letter. To seasoned investigators, it felt less like recollection and more like a script. Behind the scenes, analysts layered timelines. When the colchicine was acquired, when the supplements were likely tampered with, when Mary's symptoms began and worsened, when the anonymous letter was sent, when the web searches occurred. The lines converged. Against that backdrop, Adam's days were examined as well. His whereabouts, his activities, his electronic footprint. His life did not match a killer's. Kaitlyn's life, point by point, matched the architecture of a plan. Still, detectives knew intent and opportunity must be presented with precision. They needed to show motive that a jury would recognize, even if it wasn't a ledger of money or a document of hate. They spoke to friends who described Kaitlyn's bitterness after the breakup with Adam, her fixation on his attention, her resentment at losing her place within the family orbit. They learned about her persistence, calling, texting, showing up, long after Adam had made it clear the relationship needed to end. They heard about flare-ups, about bitterness that burned long after the embers should have cooled. To the outside world, Kaitlyn could sound reasonable and wronged. Up close, the tone was different. Controlling, relentless, and unwilling to let go. The anonymous letter, meant to bury Adam, became a spotlight on Kaitlyn. The writing echoed phrases she used in texts. The timing tracked to periods when she was isolated and angry. The dramatic language reflected a pattern of emotional manipulation seen in other communications. A second letter surfaced, then references to letters in digital drafts never sent, each variation dancing around the same theme. Adam did it. Each attempt at misdirection pulled investigators further toward the author's chair. The hardest conversations were with the Yoder family. Detectives had to speak plainly. The evidence was pointing not to a stranger and not to their son, but to a young woman they had once considered part of the family. The reaction was raw and predictable. Disbelief, nausea, grief layered with anger. They were being asked to accept not just that Mary had been murdered, but that the murder had been executed by someone who had shared their meals, their holidays, their jokes. Grief is heavy. Betrayal makes it sharp. When detectives finally confronted Kaitlyn with portions of the evidence, the digital history, the purchase records, the forensic findings, she did not collapse into confession. She deflected. She expressed outrage at the implication. She suggested alternate suspects. She returned to the theme of Adam, insisting that he had the same access she did, and more reason than she would ever have. But the facts were stubborn. The poison purchases did not point to him. The letters did not sound like him. The timing of her searches and the movements of the bottles could not be mapped onto his life. The web of cause and effect traced a route that bypassed Adam and wrapped tightly around Kaitlyn. Investigators also considered the psychology of the crime. Poison is not typically the weapon of a person who explodes in anger. It is the weapon of patience, of control, of someone who wants the mask of normalcy to stay on,
even as the target collapses. It is a method that lets the perpetrator hover nearby, to watch, to comfort, to play the part of ally while orchestrating the fall. In that light, the letters made perfect sense. If the death looked like illness, the letters made it look like a son's betrayal. The killer, having engineered the first illusion, reached for a second to cement the story. Layer on layer, lie on lie. As the case matured, the laboratory results were refined and corroborated. The amounts of colchicine in various capsules aligned with dose estimates drawn from Mary's symptoms and timing. Investigators simulated what it would take to open and reseal similar capsules and how long such tampering would require, making sure their theory matched practical reality. They traced deliveries, noted who signed for packages, and compared that against the days Kaitlyn was at the clinic or in the house. The mundane rhythms of life, work logs, phone pings, swipe cards, browser activity, became the metronome of guilt. The emotional apex of the investigation arrived when detectives laid the chain before the family. The poisoned supplements that Mary trusted, the anonymous letters that framed her son, the searches that showed planning and cold calculation, the purchases that were made months in advance, the proximity of the suspect to every instrument of harm. For Adam, it meant facing two horrors at once, the loss of his mother and the realization that the woman he'd once loved had allegedly tried to destroy him too. For Mary's husband and the rest of the family, it meant reinterpreting every mundane memory of the months before her death. The cup of tea on the counter, the vitamin bottles in the cabinet, the receptionist in the clinic who smiled as patients came and went. Ordinary objects and people, now charged with meaning they wished they had never learned. By the time investigators prepared their arrest paperwork, the case did not rest on a single dramatic revelation, but on a symphony of hard facts. The poisoned capsules were the instrument, the letters were the decoy, the searches were the blueprint, the purchases were the supply line, the access was the opportunity, and the motive, small, human, and devastating, was revenge dressed up as righteousness. When they moved to arrest Kaitlyn Conley, they did so with the gravity such a case deserves. She was taken into custody and charged, and the matter shifted from the quiet, methodical work of detectives to the public crucible of a courtroom. The Yoder family watched with an expression that has no single word: grief, anger, relief, and dread all standing shoulder to shoulder. Relief that someone would be held accountable, dread that the process would force them to relive Mary's death piece by piece, this time under the fluorescent lights of a trial. The prosecutors knew the road ahead would not be simple. Poisoning cases are complex. Jurors must be walked through science while never losing sight of the human story. Defense attorneys would call the evidence circumstantial. They would echo the anonymous letter's theme and point to Adam, to access, to possibility. They would challenge timelines and motives, question lab methods, and ask jurors to consider each element in isolation. The state would need to knit every strand together until there was only one reasonable conclusion left standing. But for the investigators, who had lived inside the case for months, there was clarity. The woman once welcomed as a daughter figure in the Yoder home, the woman who sat at the front desk of Mary's clinic greeting patients by name, now stood accused of killing the matriarch she had smiled at daily. And the charge did not rest on rumor or outrage. It was built on the careful, relentless accumulation of proof. The community, watching from the outside, began to understand that Mary's death was not a random tragedy. It was a breach of trust so intimate that it shocked even seasoned officers. People asked themselves hard questions about the boundaries between love and control, kindness and manipulation, grief and performance. They looked at the photographs of Mary, the bike rides, the family holidays, the open smile, and felt the weight of a truth that would not budge. Someone close had engineered her end. As the case file closed on the investigation phase and opened on the prosecution phase, one final realization hung over everyone involved. This was never going to be a comfortable story. It was not built for neat endings or tidy lessons. It was a reminder that the most dangerous threats sometimes walk through our door without knocking, carrying flowers in one hand and poison in the other. And so the stage shifted. With the evidence stacked, poisoned supplements, forged letters, digital blueprints, purchases tied to the accused, police handed the baton to the courts. Justice would have to be hammered in public now, in front of 12 citizens and a judge, while cameras waited outside, and a family tried to hold itself together on the inside. The woman once seen as a daughter figure in the Yoder family now stood accused of killing the matriarch. But proving her guilt in court would prove far more difficult than anyone imagined.
By the time investigators closed in on Kaitlyn Conley, the Yoder family's world had already been torn apart. But what came next would push them into an even darker storm. 2 trials, years of hearings, and the unbearable weight of sitting in the same courtroom as the woman accused of slowly murdering their mother. The first trial began in 2017, almost 2 years after Mary's death. Courtrooms can often feel clinical, stripped of emotion, but in this case, every session carried the electric tension of betrayal. Kaitlyn walked in calm, almost composed, her face giving little away. For Mary's family, the sight was unbearable. This was the young woman who had once sat at their dinner table, shared stories, laughed with them. Now she stood accused of slipping poison into Mary's daily supplements, knowing exactly how it would rip her body apart from the inside. The prosecution opened with a simple but devastating claim. Kaitlyn had killed Dr.Mary Yoder out of revenge. The motive, they argued, was tied to her fractured relationship with Adam Yoder, Mary's son. Their romance had been stormy, filled with breakups and reconciliations, but when it finally ended, prosecutors said, Kaitlyn's feelings twisted into something toxic. She wanted Adam to hurt. And what better way than to take away the person he loved most? Piece by piece, prosecutors laid out the chilling evidence. They showed jurors text messages and emails that hinted at Kaitlyn's anger, her bitterness over Adam, her resentment toward the Yoders. They presented her Google search history, pages about colchicine, its lethal doses, how symptoms unfold over time. They showed records that she had actually ordered colchicine online months before Mary fell ill. And then came the letters. Anonymous letters sent to the police, designed to frame Adam for his own mother's death. Handwriting experts testified that, despite Kaitlyn's attempts to disguise them, the style matched hers. Even the ink and printer linked back. The picture prosecutors painted was devastating. Not only had she poisoned Mary, but she tried to destroy Adam by pushing investigators to believe he was the killer. The defense countered with everything they had. They argued that the case was built on circumstantial evidence. No one had seen Kaitlyn slip anything into Mary's supplements. There was no camera, no direct witness, no confession. They suggested that others in the family could have had access, that digital evidence could be misinterpreted. They tried to recast Kaitlyn as a young woman unfairly targeted, dragged into suspicion because of a messy breakup. The Yoder family sat through it all. Some days they broke down quietly, holding each other's hands as prosecutors replayed Mary's final hours. Other days they sat stone-faced, unwilling to give Kaitlyn even a flicker of emotion. But inside, the pain was raw. To watch lawyers argue over their mother's death, to hear someone describe her agony in clinical terms, was almost unbearable. As weeks passed, the case built toward its climax. Both sides gave closing arguments that cut like knives. The prosecution called it calculated murder, a crime of patience and cruelty. The defense insisted it was a tragedy, yes, but one without enough proof to convict. When the jury went out to deliberate, the entire courtroom held its breath. Hours stretched into days, and finally they returned. The result? A deadlock. The jurors could not agree. Some believed the evidence pointed clearly to Kaitlyn. Others were not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge declared a mistrial. For the Yoder family, it was like losing Mary all over again. Justice had slipped away, and the person they believed responsible for her death was still free, still walking outside the courthouse doors. They wept. They raged. But prosecutors were not finished. Later that same year, the state brought Kaitlyn to trial again. This time, the tone was different. The prosecution knew they had to sharpen their case, strip away confusion, and hammer home motive. They leaned heavily on the story of her relationship with Adam. Friends testified that Kaitlyn's obsession hadn't ended when the romance did. They recalled how she spoke bitterly about him, how she seemed unable to let go. The jury heard how Mary had been nothing but kind to her, yet in the end, kindness wasn't enough to stop her wrath.
Prosecutors also emphasized Kaitlyn's chilling internet searches, not just about poison, but about prison life. She had looked up what sentences people received for poisoning, what life inside prison might be like. It painted a haunting picture. She hadn't acted in ignorance. She had studied, prepared, and even imagined what would happen if she were caught. The defense fought back just as fiercely. They argued that prosecutors were twisting digital evidence, that searches could be explained away, that text messages taken out of context didn't prove murder. They pointed again to the lack of physical proof tying Kaitlyn's hands to the poisoned supplements. To convict her, they said, would be to punish her for suspicion, not certainty. But the emotional weight in the room was impossible to ignore. Witness after witness painted Mary as a woman who had no enemies, no dark secrets, no reason for anyone to want her dead. The only connection left was Kaitlyn, the woman once embraced by the family, now accused of tearing it apart. When it came time for closing arguments, prosecutors leaned into the raw betrayal at the heart of the case. They told the jury, this wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a moment of rage. This was a young woman who sat at Mary Yoder's table, smiled at her, worked beside her, and then deliberately poisoned her day by day until her body gave out. That's not an accident. That's not circumstantial. That's murder. The defense responded with equal force, warning jurors not to convict out of emotion. The law demands proof, they argued, and proof beyond a reasonable doubt simply isn't here. The jury went out once again. This time, the Yoder family could barely breathe. Hours passed. Then came the knock at the door. Verdict reached. Everyone rose. The foreman stood. And in a clear voice, the words rang out, guilty, but not of murder. Guilty of first-degree manslaughter.
The courtroom erupted with emotion. Some cried in relief that at least she would be punished. Others shook with anger that it wasn't enough. For the Yoder family, it was a brutal compromise. They had hoped for murder. Instead, they heard manslaughter. It was justice, but not the full weight of justice they felt Mary deserved. Kaitlyn showed little emotion as the verdict was read. No tears, no breakdown, no visible shock. Just the same composure she had worn through the entire trial. To some, that calm looked cold, even chilling. To others, it was the mask of someone resigned to her fate. The Yoders wept in the gallery. For them, no verdict could bring Mary back. No sentence could undo the betrayal. But at least for the first time in 2 years, there was some measure of accountability. And yet questions still hung in the air. Why manslaughter, not murder? Did the jury see doubt in the evidence? Did they hesitate to convict a young woman of such a calculated killing? Those doubts would never be erased. What remained was the bitter reality. Mary Yoder's life had ended not by accident, not by illness, but by someone she trusted. And though the law had spoken, the wound in her family would never fully heal. The trial was over, but the wounds were still open. For nearly 2 years, the Yoder family had sat in courtrooms listening to their mother's final days dissected in detail. 2 trials, 2 verdicts, endless testimony. By 2017, they were drained. Yet one final step remained: sentencing. That day would decide how long the woman who poisoned Dr.Mary Yoder would spend behind bars. The courtroom was heavy with silence as Kaitlyn Conley was led in. She looked small in her prison uniform, but her face was steady, almost cold. No fear, no visible regret. She stood only a few feet from the family whose lives she had torn apart. For some, that distance felt unbearable. The judge's voice carried across the room. 23 years in state prison for first-degree manslaughter. Not murder, not life. 23 years. A gasp rippled through the gallery. To the Yoder family, it was justice, but not enough. Their mother was never coming back. Nothing could measure against that. When the time came for impact statements, Mary's family rose. One of her daughters faced Kaitlyn directly. Her voice trembled, but her words cut sharp.
You sat at our dinner table. My children called you family. And yet you poisoned the woman who showed you nothing but kindness. You didn't just kill my mother. You poisoned all of us. Every day we wake up in a world you shattered.
Then Adam Yoder, Mary's son and Kaitlyn's former boyfriend, stood. His voice cracked, but anger pushed through.
I trusted you. I loved you. And you framed me for my own mother's death. Do you understand what that means? You wanted me in prison for something you did. How can someone carry that much hate?
He stopped, staring at her. Kaitlyn didn't look away. Her silence felt like a weapon. Until then, Kaitlyn had been largely quiet, often insisting she was innocent. But at sentencing, she spoke briefly. Her words stunned the courtroom. She looked at the judge, then at the family.
I didn't kill Mary. You're all convinced I'm a monster, but you're wrong. If I had wanted to, I could have made sure no one ever found out how, but I didn't. I'm here because people needed someone to blame.
The gallery froze. The implication hung heavy. She denied guilt, yet hinted at knowledge of how to kill without detection. It was a chilling mix of defiance and arrogance. For the Yoder family, it felt like a second wound. One juror later told reporters that moment stayed with them more than any testimony. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't remorse. It was almost pride. Pride in the idea that she could have gotten away with it. Outside the courtroom, the community of Utica, New York, reeled. This wasn't New York City. This was a close-knit place where Mary had treated patients for decades. Everyone knew her. Everyone trusted her. Neighbors remembered Mary's laughter, her habit of handing out health advice with a smile. Patients wrote in newspapers about how she eased their pain, asked about their children, and treated them like family. Now the same community learned that the young woman who once worked at Mary's clinic, the one they had seen at the reception desk, laughing, carrying files, had been convicted of poisoning her. The betrayal was almost impossible to comprehend. This was not just about poison. It was betrayal. Mary had treated Kaitlyn like a daughter. She gave her a job, welcomed her into family events, offered her trust. In return, Kaitlyn slipped her a poison that tore her body apart and wrote anonymous letters trying to frame Adam. It wasn't a single act of violence. It was calculated destruction. She tried to kill Mary, and she tried to destroy the son she once claimed to love. That double betrayal was almost too much to bear. During sentencing, Adam said,
You didn't just kill my mother. You tried to erase me. That's something I will carry for the rest of my life.
The sentence, 23 years, divided opinion. Some felt it was fair. The evidence was circumstantial. The jury compromised on manslaughter. Others felt it was far too little. Mary had suffered a slow, torturous death. Shouldn't a punishment reflect that? The prosecutor later admitted frustration. The evidence was strong. The poison supplements, the Google searches, the anonymous letters. But poisoning cases are notoriously difficult. Intent is everything, and the defense had managed to cast just enough doubt. For the Yoders, the law's categories, murder, manslaughter, intent, didn't matter. Their mother was gone, and the woman responsible would walk free someday. As deputies prepared to lead her out, Kaitlyn turned her head slightly toward Adam. For the first time that day, she spoke in a low voice, barely audible, but sharp enough for those nearby.
You never really knew me, Adam. None of you did. Maybe if you had, she'd still be alive.
Gasps broke out in the gallery. Adam froze. The statement wasn't just cold. It was cruel. It suggested blame, as if responsibility lay not with Kaitlyn, but with the very family she had destroyed. That single sentence became one of the most chilling moments of the entire case. Even after conviction, even facing decades in prison, she found a way to twist the knife. For the Yoders, sentencing didn't bring peace. One of Mary's sisters said it best.
Kaitlyn, you'll serve your time and one day walk free, but we are serving a life sentence. Our sister is gone forever. Our family will never be whole.
The grief was constant. Birthdays, holidays, vacations. Every moment carried the absence of Mary's laughter, her kindness, her steady presence. The house felt empty. The clinic felt hollow. Patients came in and still looked for her smile, only to remember she would never return. And in quiet moments, they replayed the crime in their minds. The poison, the betrayal, the courtroom words, the cruel final exchange. In the weeks after sentencing, letters poured into local papers. Some called the punishment too light. Others reflected on how quickly jealousy can turn to obsession, and obsession to murder. One patient wrote, "Dr. Yoder healed my back, but more than that, she lifted my spirit every visit. To think that someone sat in her office, smiling, and plotted her death is something I can't forget." The case spread beyond Utica. National media covered it. Psychology professors used it to discuss revenge-driven homicide. It became known as a family insider poisoning, one of the most unsettling forms of crime. Not a stranger in the dark, but someone trusted, someone welcomed, someone who turned trust into a weapon. As Kaitlyn was led away in chains, the Yoder family walked out of the courtroom. Justice had been done on paper, but justice could not heal. For them, every day without Mary was another sentence. Every family photo now had a missing piece. Every dinner table felt incomplete. Every holiday reminded them of what had been stolen. At Mary's funeral, hundreds had come. Patients, neighbors, friends. A white coffin rested at the front, surrounded by flowers. Her children cried as they laid their hands on it. That memory replayed as they left the courthouse, the day they had truly said goodbye. The judge's gavel had fallen. Kaitlyn's fate was sealed. But the Yoders knew. Their true sentence had no end. The woman they once welcomed as family now sat behind bars, sentenced for poisoning the matriarch who trusted her. But even with a verdict and a prison term, the aftermath left deeper questions. Could love truly twist into such hatred? And what does justice mean when the pain never ends? The courtroom emptied. The gavel had fallen. But the story of Dr. Mary Yoder's murder did not end with a sentence. For her family, for Kaitlyn Conley, and for the small New York community that had once trusted them both, the case left a legacy that reshaped lives long after the trial. For the Yoder family, life became a before and after. Before July 2015, their days were defined by the rhythm of family gatherings, shared meals, and the constant presence of Mary's laughter. After her death, there was only silence. Her children described the years that followed as living in shadow. Birthdays, weddings, and holidays all carried her absence. One daughter admitted in an interview,
Every milestone feels incomplete. We look for her in the crowd, and she isn't there. It never stops hurting.
Adam, the son Kaitlyn once tried to frame, carried an especially heavy burden. He wasn't just grieving his mother. He lived with the knowledge that the woman he loved, the woman he trusted, had not only poisoned his mother but had tried to destroy him too. Friends noticed he withdrew for years, struggling with guilt he couldn't shake.
I keep asking myself, how did I not see it? How did I bring her into our lives?
Mary's siblings were vocal after sentencing. They wanted people to remember who Mary was, a healer, a mother, a mentor, not just a victim of poison. They organized memorial events, spoke publicly about her life, and pushed to have her legacy remembered in the communities she once served. But beneath the public strength, their private grief was unrelenting. One sister said,
We don't get parole. We don't get 23 years. Our sentence is forever.
For Kaitlyn, prison was not an end. It was a new existence. Reports described her as reserved, often detached, She continued to maintain her innocence, telling anyone who would listen that she had been unfairly convicted. But her lack of remorse was what struck observers most. Former acquaintances who once called her bright and funny admitted they now remembered her differently. One said, "It's like she had two faces, the one she showed the world and the one she hid until it was too late." Inside prison, Kaitlyn faced the reality of the 23-year sentence. She was 24 when convicted. She would be in her mid-40s when eligible for release. A lifetime stretched out before her, defined by bars and schedules. Some wondered if she would ever truly feel the weight of what she had done. The community did not forgive. Even years later, when her name surfaced in the news, comment sections filled with anger. People saw her as the very embodiment of betrayal, welcomed into a family, trusted by a mother, and yet willing to poison her for revenge. Her punishment was not only prison, it was also the erasure of trust. No matter how many years she served, Kaitlyn would always be remembered not as a young woman with promise, but as the insider who turned family love into deadly hatred. Utica, New York, was shaken. This was not a city hardened to violent crime. Dr. Mary Yoder's death shattered a sense of safety people had taken for granted. The realization that betrayal could come from someone so close left residents uneasy. In the aftermath, conversations spread about the hidden dangers of toxic relationships. Parents told their children to watch for warning signs. Counselors spoke openly about jealousy, manipulation, and control, the slow poisons that can destroy families before anyone realizes. The case also raised awareness about rare poisons like colchicine. Hospitals in the region updated their protocols. Some doctors admitted that without the toxicology report, they might never have suspected poisoning. Mary's death forced the medical community to think differently, to consider foul play where they might once have assumed natural illness. And in classrooms, professors of psychology and criminology began using the case as a teaching tool. They pointed to it as a study in revenge, manipulation, and betrayal within families. One professor put it simply, "This is not about strangers. This is about what happens when love rots into hate, and hate becomes a weapon." Justice was done on paper, but in reality, the cost was spread unevenly. Mary Yoder paid the ultimate price, her life, taken in pain and confusion by someone she trusted. Her family paid in grief. They lived with permanent loss and with the haunting knowledge that the killer once sat at their table, smiled at their children, and was welcomed as one of their own. Kaitlyn Conley paid with her freedom. 23 years in prison, a lifetime of being remembered for betrayal. Yet some argued she never showed the remorse that true accountability demands. Adam Yoder paid a unique and cruel price. He was framed. Even as he mourned, he had to endure suspicion. For months, whispers followed him that maybe he had been involved. Though cleared, the scars of that suspicion never fully faded. The community paid in trust. A city once defined by closeness now carried the reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers are not outsiders, but those we let closest to us. In the end, everyone carried a sentence. The murder of Dr. Mary Yoder remains a chilling case study. It raises questions that have no easy answers. How can love twist into such deep hatred? Could the signs have been recognized earlier? The jealousy, the obsession, the bitterness. Why does justice feel incomplete, even when a sentence is handed down? Psychologists point to Kaitlyn's behavior as a warning. Jealousy left unchecked can become destructive. Obsession with revenge can consume a person until morality disappears. And when those emotions are allowed to fester inside intimate relationships, the results can be catastrophic. For families, the lesson is both simple and impossible. Trust, but stay aware. Danger doesn't always wear the mask of a stranger. Sometimes it sits across the dinner table. Dr. Mary Yoder spent her life healing others. She was a mother, a mentor, a friend. Her death was not just a tragedy, it was a betrayal. Betrayal by someone she once embraced like family. Her case reminds us that the deepest wounds are not always physical. They are emotional. They are the wounds of trust shattered, of love twisted, of families broken from within. Kaitlyn Conley will one day walk free, but the Yoder family will never be the same. Their sentence is forever. And the community that loved Mary will always remember the day trust turned deadly. And now, I want to hear from you. Do you think justice was served with Kaitlyn's 23-year sentence, or was it too lenient for the crime she committed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if there's another case you'd like me to cover, whether it's a famous one or a hidden story waiting to be told, drop your suggestions. Your idea might be the next story we dive into.